Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for staying. We are removing our masks because we've actually been tested just like the actors have been tested. So please make sure that your masks stay on even as we sort of open up for questions and everything. Welcome to What If? Alternative Realities in Sophocles Philoctetes. We have our guest today is Dr. Sigelman. Dr. Sigelman is an associate professor of ancient Greek at Bryn Mawr College. Dr. Sigelman conducts scholarly research on the poetry and literature of classical antiquity and regularly teaches both undergraduate courses and graduate seminars on the language and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. And you're currently working on a book about the ethics of Greek tragedy. So let's welcome Dr. Sigelman. So I have a couple of questions to get us started off, and then we'll get to a chance where if people in the audience have questions or thoughts about the production, then we can sort of open up that conversation that way. So I think one of the unique things about the Sophocles' version of this play is it's one of the Greek tragedies that we have still in existence that has this happy ending, right? As opposed to some of the Greek tragedies maybe people are more familiar with, Oedipus, Medea, Antigone, where there's sort of that emphasis on the bad ending and death and all those things. So I'd just love for you to hear a little bit about sort of what that means to you in terms of like a tragedy and the possibility of happy ending at the end of tragedy, and then even more so specifically in this play, the use of the deus ex machina, which is that Heracles moment at the end, the Hercules moment.
Sure, yeah, so it is a question that is much discussed, and there's no, just the general question about what does it mean when a tragedy has a happy ending? So there is, I just want to kind of start by acknowledging that there is no one sort of consensus, but it's something that is much discussed. There are some tragedies that feel kind of hunky-dory in the way they conclude. The Philoctetes is a little bit different in that because it has the deus ex machina finale, which again we sort of got a sense for in the Heaney version, but it was a little bit erased because you don't actually see Heracles or Hercules. He's referred to by both versions of the name. In the way that Sophocles originally composed the play, you actually see this divine-like figure suspended in the sky out of the blue over the actors. And so it is a device that's frequently used in Greek tragedy. My own take on it is that it's almost the sort of happy ending that underscores the impossibility of a happy ending. In that there's this impasse that is reached, or a terrible tragedy that is, in our sense of the word, that something horrible is on stage. And when the tragedian kind of brings in this easy resolution, or almost kind of like cutting the Gordian knot, it's almost an acknowledgement that like, hey, there is no resolution possible. The only way to resolve it is by a god stepping in. So it's an acknowledgement of an impasse, too. That's what I would say. There are some happy end tragedies, the Alcestis famously in the works of Euripides, where a happy ending is achieved without this trick. And so that is actually even more of kind of a conundrum. Is this actually a tragedy in our sense of the word? But I'd say when we get a deus ex machina, there's almost always this feeling of it's almost a little too good to be true, and this is kind of the tragedian's way of acknowledging that.
So do you think that, sort of either in the debates among scholars or just in your own sense of researching Greek history, do you subscribe to the notion that audiences would have been commenting and sort of criticizing the use of deus ex machina, or do you feel like it was just a generally accepted thing, especially because of when you were talking about the device, right? We're actually talking about a crane, right? Where there would be an actor who would be flying over the stage as they were portraying a god. So I don't know if you have thoughts on if you sort of subscribe to that notion of audiences picking apart the use of deus ex machina or not.
So we don't have any evidence that ancient Athenians, ancient Greeks looked at this and kind of had the same interpretation or approach to it that I just offered. It was a very common trick, and we know that others besides Sophocles used it. So, so I'm hesitant to kind of speak for the Athenians, especially because for them, gods were divine, like they were real. It wasn't a, it wasn't a as if sort of thing. So I'm not sure what the Athenians themselves thought.
No, thank you. And I think it's just really important for us to acknowledge in this room, right? Rather than just sort of like supposing or repeating these theories that get thrown out over and over and over again, to actually admit that like there are things that we don't know and we can't know about what the culture is like. I super appreciate that, so thank you. Okay, so next question.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about your response to the way that the chorus was used in Heaney's piece, and then a little bit just about the ancient Greek chorus would be great, just to give us some context.
Sure. So, and this may kind of bleed into the related issue of just how does Heaney's version compare to the original?
Right.
I would say that Heaney definitely takes the most liberty with the chorus, which is probably not surprising. In general, he stays really close to the text of Sophocles, but it's with the chorus that he really kind of indulges himself, allows himself to make these kind of very modern 20th century commentaries. And some of that was very obvious, as in that famous last ode that we heard. A couple of other thoughts about the difference in the treatment of the chorus by Sophocles versus Heaney. There were only 3 of them in the original Greek theater. We would have seen somewhere between 12 and 15 members of the chorus probably. They would obviously have all been male, as would have all been all the actors. And then the other big difference is we saw them chanting in unison, which I was amazed at how much coordination that must have taken for 3 people to talk in unison. It would have been both more complex but also easier in the original because they would have all been singing and dancing at the same time. So there would be this very complex musical choreography sort of going on. And that's something that we cannot at all reproduce. So this was an amazing sort of approximation of that, but it also underscored just how different the modern chorus has to be.
Yeah, and so in the program, we actually got permission from the Heaney estate to publish the note that he wrote for a previous production, in which he just shares a little bit. There's a little bit at the end of that note where he talks about the 2 moments when he deviates. One is this famous quotation that politicians, Bill Clinton, Joseph Biden in his inauguration, right, sort of go to this hope and history rhyme moment. But the other moment that Heaney actually imposes is that opening, too, which is really interesting, talking about the 3 Greek heroes and like all of that distance. Okay, so my last, and then we can sort of open it up if other people have thoughts or questions. I think it's really interesting in sort of having seen this piece over and over again, and then I had to write an education guide because we do have a student group that is going to come and see, at least 2 student groups who are going to come and see productions. And in sort of like doing that comparison between the Trojan War story as it's depicted in Homer, and in this version, I think it's just really interesting that this character is so minor to Homer's depiction. But we know that there were both versions, this version that Sophocles wrote, as well as the other 2 Greek tragedians also wrote a version. So can you just talk a little bit about like why the 3 tragic playwrights would have been so focused on this character when it doesn't appear, like when it seems like such a minor part of some of the other versions of the Trojan War?
Sure, and I'm going to segue a little bit into this whole theme that's fascinating for me of alternative realities.
Yes,
with your
which is why we're here.
Because we're all in an alternative reality. Sure, so yes, in Homer we get this bare, something like a 4-line mention in the Iliad in the catalog of ships that, hey, there was this Philoctetes who got stranded on an island, but later the Greeks did pick him back up and brought him to Troy. So the question, Danielle, that you're asking, first of all, is why is there not a lot on him in Homer, and why are the tragedians so fascinated by him? I cannot say why there's not tons on him in Homer, But we do know that Philoctetes was treated, though the myth was treated in detail in the Trojan cycle, what is known as the Trojan cycle, that did not come down to us. Instead, all we have is brief descriptions and summaries of the Trojan cycle. So basically, we tend to think of Greek epic or Homer as just two famous poems that have come down to us, the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you were living in ancient Greece, you would be familiar with a much broader array of epic, some of which was also ascribed to Homer, which dealt with all these other stories surrounding the saga of the Trojan War. And some of them were really cool, like Amazons marching on Troy and the queen of the Amazons having a love affair with Achilles. And gosh darn, we don't have that. It was all in the Trojan cycle. So the Philoctetes was treated in detail in the cycle. And another kind of curious thing that's been pointed out is that Greek tragedy, at least what has come down to us, loves taking plots from these cycle poems, but never from the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's almost like there was this acknowledgement that, hey, Homer dealt with this, we're not going to touch this, we're going to deal with these kind of more minor epic topics. So I think that was definitely part of it. It is true that Euripides and Aeschylus and a couple of other tragedians about whom we really know nothing much at all, have all composed poems on the Philoctetes. That in itself is actually not that surprising because Greek tragedy recycled myths all the time. There were a gazillion tragedies all composed on the myth of Oedipus. So
right, and we know we have at least existing versions of the Electra story, right?
We happen to have three different versions of the Electra story, which is this kind of fossil of what it felt like to compare different treatments of the same myth. But that's the only one that we actually that allows us to do that. And then I'll just conclude returning to the why alternative realities. So Sophocles does something unique compared to Aeschylus and Euripides. So as you guys just saw, so much of this play that we just watched was about this relationship of Neoptolemus and Philoctetes, and that is completely the invention of Sophocles. In all the standard treatments of the Philoctetes myth, Neoptolemus has nothing to do with it. So this incredibly close bond on which the entirety of Sophocles and Heaney's play is predicated, that is Sophocles' creation. So I can talk later about why that's an alternative reality, but that's his idea.
No, please finish your thought, because I think it's so interesting, right? Like we get into this notion of like, especially with classic theater, right? Like we think we know the text, right? We think that there's one version or one definitive way of reading the text when we're constantly doing productions, we're constantly rethinking things. And in sort of this ancient Greek mentality at the festival, they would have been sort of recycling the myths, right? So it would be part of the discussion, like the discussion we're gonna have with all of you, where it's like, so what's different about this version? What's almost the way that like fairy tales work, right? Where it's like we think we all know Cinderella, so when you go and see a new version of Cinderella, you're actually like looking at like what's new, how are they handling the story? So do you want to just share a little bit about like your thoughts on like why Neoptolemus?
Sure. So there were all sorts of different idea or kind of mythical versions of what would it take for the Greeks to win the Trojan War, because they were fighting for 10 years, and how do we finally take this city? The most famous version that probably most of us are most familiar with is the Trojan horse. So Odysseus finally has this idea, hey, let's use the Trojan horse. But two other versions are all relevant to today's play. We have to go back to Skyros and bring back the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, or we have to go back to Lemnos and bring back Philoctetes and his bow. And they were unrelated ideas and unrelated versions. So what Philoctetes and Neoptolemus have in common, just kind of objectively speaking, is they're both representatives of a new generation that has ties to this very kind of titanic and powerful earlier generation. So Neoptolemus kind of has to represent and live up to Achilles, his father. Philoctetes represents and is trying to live up to Heracles, who gave him this bow. So they have this responsibility on their shoulders, and fate predicted individually for the two of them that, hey, the taking of Troy is on you. So it's a lot of responsibility that each of them is bearing. And again, Sophocles said, hey, let me bring them together. And after Sophocles came up with that idea, he obviously needed to kind of say, okay, how am I going to do this? And the way he does that is through Odysseus. So Odysseus is the one who brings them literally together on this little island. He was the one who stranded Philoctetes there originally. Now we see him bringing Neoptolemus. But the other cool thing is that Odysseus also feeds Neoptolemus this deception narrative. So as you guys probably noticed, the plot of the play was predicated on Neoptolemus saying, I too was wronged by Odysseus and the Atridae. They did not give me my father's armor. And one fascinating thing about the play is that we do not know if that is true or not. We're pretty sure that it's fake, but we can't be quite certain the way the play unfolds. So in that way, Neoptolemus and Philoctetes, they strengthen their bond. And then what happens in the finale, I think Heaney really picks up nicely on this, is that, and this is the alternative reality piece, is that these two guys, each of them responsible for the fall of Troy, they look at each other and they say, you know what, to do the right human thing, we're just not going to sail to Troy at all. We're just giving up on this. And they're about to sail away. And if they sail away, they're totally flaunting fate and predestination and responsibility, because they're saying, no, we've promised, we've pledged to each other to do the right human thing. And that's what's so amazing about Sophocles' play, that they're on the verge of just totally rerouting all of Greek history. Just not, we don't care about Troy. We're not going to sail there. And Sophocles kind of augments that by bringing these two storylines together. So there's actually multiple kind of alternative realities all piled up upon one another. And if Heracles did not appear, then all of history would be rerouted. So for me, that's the really kind of cool underlying part about this play.
Do we have questions or comments from the audience?
Wait a minute. Did I miss something? Are they not going back to Troy at the end of this play?
So at the very end, of course they do, but only by virtue, and this gets back to Daniel's original question, only by virtue of this very artificial sort of deus ex machina device, where a god, Heracles, appears and says,
Oh, right.
no, guys, you have to go back to Troy.
On the step ladder.
Yes, whatever, yeah,
I
exactly.
forgot about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's less of a question and more of an observation. Well, first, actually, I do have a question. So, this play is dated at around when Sophocles is older when he writes this play.
Yep.
And I just can't. I teach a Greek drama course for high school students, high school seniors. But in no way am I writing a book. I can write out high school students.
One day.
But I did view Philoctetes through the theater of war. They have been producing these plays over Zoom. And I have to tell you, Steve and Anthony Wright, it was a beautiful production. Incredible. And when I think about this play, and I think about his suffering and how we discard the suffering, I mean, this is something that we can all sort of think about right now. In the midst of a pandemic, right? The play was written, during the war, like the Peloponnesian War, right? And everyone's experiencing that collective trauma, and we're experiencing collective trauma, whether it be Afghanistan or this pandemic, or the increasing divide of this country, and we discard the Philoctetes. And when I think about Neoptolemus, I see so many of my students just wanting to do the right thing, but being told to do X, Y, or Z, and grappling with that. And you see that happening, and at the end he does the right thing. But it's so powerful, and I'm sitting here shaking, just thinking about how quick we are to discard. And it's not about Neoptolemuses, because there's so many Odysseus. And this is super powerful, and it really helps us process right now. So thank you so much. Really powerful. And of course, great. I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. go ahead.
It's a simple question about the program. I don't understand what the significance of calling people covers. I mean, I don't.
Oh, so we have a cover as a person who can jump in and out of different acting roles.
Oh, so they're not. It's not active.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not but no, that's a really great question. And again, that is something that we specifically were able to do for this play, so that there's one actor who is covering the chorus and can step into any of those roles, and one of the chorus members who can step into some of the
Okay.
roles. Yes.
I guess sort of taking off of, I missed your name, but like the resonance it has now, and the discussion of the different ways these plays were told by different tragedians throughout time. What is there a link to like the historical events that were going on at this time, and why you would tell the story this way?
Yes, for sure. I'm not going to be able to kind of say line by line where there are echoes, though scholars do kind of study that. But what we do know is that the play was performed in Athens in 409 BCE. And that's just 5 years before the end of the Peloponnesian War. So by that time, Athens had been involved in this dragging on war for over 2 decades. And in 5 more years, they lost the war and were kind of actually on the verge of extinction. So this idea, the Trojan War, which is a mythical war, comes up over and over and over again in tragedies. I was just discussing this with my students the other day. And it's probably no accident, because we can't forget that these tragedies are being composed in a city and for citizens, generations of whom, the brothers, the fathers, the sons have been marching off to war. So these are very difficult times for Athens, for sure, and all of Greece.
Well, and this play is the second to last play that Sophocles wrote.
So his last is Oedipus at Colonus. Yes, I believe this would be the second to last. Yep.
So do you think that that has anything to do with sort of the decision that the different things that he puts in the text, like reflecting on his life and some of the older characters? I don't know.
I mean, one fascinating exercise that I invite everyone to try out is to read or watch the Ajax of Sophocles. So the Ajax of Sophocles is a much, much earlier play, and it's also about the Trojan War. And there are many, many echoes between the Philoctetes and the Ajax. And in fact, I don't know if you guys caught, there was a little dialogue between Philoctetes and Neoptolemus about, oh my goodness, Ajax is dead, how could he be? And I always read that as actually Sophocles thinking back to his own play. And so this is kind of, an oblique way of answering your question, Daniel, but that's a great way to kind of track young Sophocles through to old Sophocles and his development as a playwright, because he's clearly thinking back to his younger own self-treatment of this similar topic.
Yes.
Definitely a mythological war. We have the ruins of Troy and big heaps everywhere. Definitely mythological Trojan War. We never won the horse, but Trojan.
You're asking whether it's true that the Trojan War was just a mythological war?
No, I'm asking if it was, do we know for sure that it wasn't a war, that it wasn't a war?
So what we know now is that there was a Trojan War, and there were probably multiple Trojan Wars, of which, by the way, there are some traces in Greek myth that there were several Trojan Wars. For the people of the times of Sophocles, they didn't think of it as mythological. They thought of it as very, very real. But they still realized that it was very, very long time ago, way about 800 years before the times of Sophocles. So they thought of it as kind of covered in the mists of time, is maybe a less anachronistic way of describing it, from if we're to take Sophocles' point of view.
Given that one of your scholarly interests is in the ethics of Sophocles, what do you see as some of the ethical issues that this play addresses?
Sure, no, thank you for that. I mean, I think ethics are front and center in the relationship of Neoptolemus and Philoctetes and how we saw it develop on stage just now. And I was actually incredibly grateful to the actors for portraying Neoptolemus as this kind of, so certain of himself and, such an upstart young man. and then, completely changing in the course of less than an hour. And this kind of, and again, for the character, it's all about, what does it mean to live up to my father's fame? What does it mean to make my dead father proud of me? So I think just on that kind of very even basic level, this play is, and it also takes this giant kind of panorama of the Trojan War, and it makes it all about this relationship of just these two people. And if I can just talk on for another minute, I'll point out that something else that's totally unique in Sophocles' treatment of this play is his choice to make Lemnos deserted. Lemnos was not at all a deserted island. It was heavily colonized by Athenians themselves, and even in mythology, it was always portrayed as inhabited by someone. So the choice that Sophocles very consciously makes of making it an abandoned, deserted island definitely contributes to this. This is such a start. I mean, Sophocles didn't know about a black box theater, but it's as though he did. It's just these two guys, and it's they are human relationship, human to human being. So.
Yes.
I have a sort of just different perspective on this. I came to see this play because I've always wanted to see it, because I'm a real big fan of Seamus Heaney, the poet. And of course the lines at the end, I've heard them so often, but I've never seen them in context. But last night I was reading about the first performance of this play, and it was played in Northern Ireland, and it was the beginning of the thoughts that America was going to intercede and start up the peace talks. They were started in the 1993 and 1994. So when it was first performed there, the audience had many members of the various components of the war in Northern Ireland. And apparently they were extremely moved by this discussion of a war and the complexity of it and how do you end it. And they were right in the middle of a war, so they translated this play about an ancient war into their own war. And I guess it's wonderful that that Seamus Heaney could talk about such a sensitive subject. I mean, there was war going on in Northern Ireland at the time, and the peacemakers that were in the room listening to this saw the pulse, that it hit the pulse of the people themselves, being in what they considered an endless war, which had been going on really since 1920 in Northern Ireland. And it was about to come to an end. They were about to end it.
Well, and there's some really interesting parallels there, right? When you think about the ancient Greeks going back to a war that was before their time, right? Heaney doing the same thing, right? Referencing the Trojan War as something that is distant, but that can also be completely reflective of the things that were going on when he wrote it, things that are going on today.
And he very shortly thereafter won the Nobel Prize in Literature. This helped.
I have a question. Now, following up on that question, there was a comment, am I being true to what is right for me? Or am I being loyal and doing the right thing for my country? Saying both of these things are the right thing to do, but what's right for me is what's morally right. And I'm just wondering, was that Seamus, I'm going to murder his name, Heaney's take on was that his writing, or is that the Sophocles writing, or Sophocles, is that the ancient speaking?
No, that's a great question. So some of that theme is definitely in Sophocles, and I think if it weren't, I think Heaney saw it and he kind of brought it out, and I think he definitely developed it. I mean, one thing that I see in Heaney's translation is there's this focus on kind of the Greeks almost as a nationality, which was not the case in ancient Greece. There was no such nationality as the Greeks. So the Greeks saw themselves as, somehow all related, but they were also very divided. So, which allowed Neoptolemus to just say, hey, I'm just going to be king of Skiros. I don't care about you guys. I'm sailing back home. So it's a very different sort of almost political mentality than what we moderns have. And so that's also where I see Seamus Heaney kind of modernizing the mentality a little bit of this opposition between kind of what's good for the Greeks as a whole versus versus me, myself.
I guess I have kind of a question going off of that, like the authority in the play, like they decide they're going to leave because they don't have to listen to what Odysseus says, but then they do have to go because it's what the gods want. So like how does, I don't know, how does that wrap up with state power or government, or, you know, the way that they thought of Greece as a whole, or?
Right, so I think that, again, that's a good reminder that there was no central power. The closest that the Greeks at that time, and again, these are mythical times, these are not even historical Greek times. The closest that it got is that, you know, when the Greeks marched against Troy, each city-state was led by its own king. So these were times when kings ruled the individual little polis, the individual little city-states. And each king led his own army. So Odysseus had his own men. Neoptolemus had his own men. You know, Philoctetes would have had his own men. God knows what happened to them. They're not. They seem to have disappeared. And then they had a leader over all of them, and that was Agamemnon. But you feel that tension in Homer and elsewhere very strongly. Nobody really likes Agamemnon, and nobody really listens to him. Because politically he has no, he's just a figurehead. He has no value.
Yes?
If they're going back to the morally proper people leaving in the opposite direction of Troy, and the god comes in and says, no, you should go back to Troy, and therefore they do, is that Sophocles saying that you have to follow the state as opposed to your inner moral voice?
I think that's, well, I just want to acknowledge, I don't think there's any one simple answer to this question. I think it's a big question. You know, what does the finale mean? And I think actually Heaney and Sophocles treat it a little bit differently. But my interpretation, so my answer to your question will actually be along the lines of what I was saying earlier about the deus ex machina device in Greek tragedy. The way I read it is that Sophocles has shown us that human morality, human ethics can surpass even the decrees of fate. When a person needs to do what's right, he can even send decrees of fate to hell and say, no, I'm just sailing back home because I promised, I pledged my word. But then, you know, we kind of have to save face by saying, okay, well actually they did sail to Troy. We all know that they did. So we'll insert this artificial deus ex machina trick that will allow us to stick to the original line of history. And that's kind of my interpretation of what Sophocles does. Seamus Heaney does something very beautiful with that finale. He talks about this kind of opening of channels between, between the supernatural and the human sphere, and I think that needs more analysis of kind of what does that finale mean for him. In either scenario, I don't think the finale means, hey, we're just going to listen to authority. I think that's pretty clear.
But if the Greeks actually believe that's the god directing, then isn't that the moral of the whole
And they talk about that explicitly in the play. They say, well, if the gods tell us, let's go and do this, but we're not going to listen to Odysseus. We're not doing this because Odysseus is telling us. We're doing this because the gods will it.
Yes?
So, as sort of an experience of the play and of the beautiful actors coming together, I feel that it was morality on both levels, that it wasn't an either and or, it was an and and that they had come to terms with one another so that there was sort of a redemption within themselves first, peace within themselves, a redemption in the relationship with one another, the covenant that they had made. And so there was a truth there that was morally right for them. And yet, here was this other layer that was there to support almost what they had. It wasn't a defiling or a condemnation of the decision. It was yes, and now the strength of who you are based on this beautiful relationship that you forged, now you truly have the strength. You have eradicated these shackles. And now it's bigger than you, and you're capable of doing it together. And there is an endpoint here that is glorious, that is defined by the gods, your destiny to begin with. But it also, we allowed you as gods to sort through those choices to come to that moment. So to me, it was beautiful on both levels, that it wasn't the state, it was a support of the gods, but also, hey guys, this is bigger than you. Now you've appeased your own sense of, great, we're doing the right thing, let's go home and put our feet up. No, now there's still work to be done.
Yes.
I really enjoyed how the actress transformed herself into Heracles at the top of the ladder. Did that. It seemed very emotional. I thought I detected some genuine emotion or tears. Can I ask her to comment on that?
That's me, yes, hello. Yeah, there was some genuine moments in that speech. I mean, you see us standing, we experience the show from beginning to end, every day. And so like seeing the experience in different ways and nuances is something that kind of makes an imprint throughout the course of those 90 minutes. And then there's this huge speech at the end to say, no, I split like living and the dead, like to come and tell you, like, you need to go, and like it's very much like a motherly, I feel like, experience of like trying to bestow this knowledge onto someone. And then I think about my dad, and it just makes me very emotional. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, up there.
So, whose view of fate versus free will are we seeing in this play? Is that Heaney's? Is that Sophocles? Is that ancient Greeks? Who had that heavy hand of fate?
I would say, you're seeing two layers. You're seeing probably about 80% Sophocles, and then sort of Heaney's meditations on that. And again, I think the meditations really come, these kind of modern meditations, you really feel them most at the opening and at the conclusions. And I loved how the chorus did that by putting their masks down. So there was this kind of very nice dramatic distinction of the chorus, almost kind of speaking, in their kind of modern selves without the Greek masks on. That's how I would. Yes.
Just a couple of things. 409 BC, right? 1992. Wouldn't Heaney have, instead of having a machina, change that, knowing that the gods really weren't Greek, there were no such things as Greek gods or Zeus or anything? Wouldn't he have maybe done something a little bit more realistic, like having, and I don't know what it might be.
I think one of my responses that I find sort of really surprising is how faithful Heaney is to the story, right? He adds those two moments, but there are so many, and again, it's sort of labeled as this version of Sophocles' text, right? So like, what is that impulse to be, I don't know, faithful is probably the wrong word, but just really excited about the story and telling it.
Yeah.
The other question is about Odysseus. I mean, he got a reputation supposedly of being a snake, all that. Did he have that reputation back in 409? And when
I love that question because it's something I'm fascinated by. So this gets back to this distinction between Homer, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then this other mythical lore that was available to Sophocles and his contemporaries, and that we only know about secondhand. So Odysseus in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, is actually a pretty honorable guy. You can sort of read, something kind of a little bit of sarcasm there, but mostly he's brave, he's honorable. But then the stories, kind of the non-Homeric lore, often portrays him very negatively. So two other interesting kind of pieces of trivia relating to this. The Greeks were so aware of these two versions of Odysseus that he even had two different patronymics. Sophocles in this play, the characters referred to him as son of Sisyphus. And Sisyphus was known for being a devious bad guy. In the Odyssey, Odysseus actually has a totally different father, Laertes, who is an honorable, hardworking farmer king. So it's fascinating that Odysseus even has two different fathers. So if you want to talk about the good Odysseus, he's the son of Laertes. The nasty Odysseus, the son of Sisyphus. Though it's clearly the same character. One other interesting point is that I referred to the Ajax by Sophocles. So in the Ajax, in this earlier play, Odysseus is accused of being a snake, but he's actually the most honorable guy in the whole play. He opens the play very honorably, and he closes the play very honorably. And then here, he is just terrible and horrible in the Philoctetes. So Sophocles himself played around with the figure of Odysseus.
Yes?
I have a follow-up question about Odysseus. The armor of Achilles played a key role in this play. Did Odysseus leave Troy with that? Do we know what happened to it?
Okay, so that again goes back to these parallel sort of realities. We cannot tell from the way that Sophocles composed the play, and I'm sure this was purposeful, we cannot tell whether he actually deprived Neoptolemus of his armor or not. Most likely he did not, but there's a chance that he actually did. One fascinating thing about that is that it puts Neoptolemus in an exactly, logically the same situation in the play as it does in that story. So in this story that is being sold to Philoctetes, Neoptolemus says, Odysseus wronged me, he deprived me of my father's armor.
Yeah, that made no sense. The story he made up was a real fact that he should have been more upset about.
So we don't know. We can't tell whether it's a real fact or not. But in the plot of the play, Odysseus is trying to deprive Philoctetes of living up to his father's fame. So it's actually a very sort of parallel situation in these two parallel stories. Odysseus playing a similar role vis-a-vis Neoptolemus, this young person, depriving him of his father's sort of memory and inheritance, and living up to his father's memory. So that's.
But the outcome's not clear.
The outcome's not clear.
Staying with Odysseus, I just want to make a comment about the portrayal. The two protagonists, the two main figures in the play, obviously demonstrate a great deal of emotion, a great deal of passion, and Philoctetes actually spends a good amount of time kind of on the ground. Quite a workout for the masterful Mr. Wright. Whereas, in the two main appearances of Odysseus, it's a whole different image to me. He's portrayed as physically upright, speaking in a very narrative, precise language, and I think it's a great contrast. However, one interprets his behaviors and moral behaviors in the past in the portrayal, I think it was very wonderful.
Yes?
So what really struck me in the play was the pride, the her pride. And I was just wondering how much these moral questions of morality and pride in general sort of intertwine in this play and Greek tragedy as a theme. Have you explored that?
The question of pride?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a theme, as you are probably guessing, that is very storied, and it really goes all the way back to the Iliad, because in a way, Philoctetes is very much an Achilles-like figure. So somebody who's wrong, because the Iliad famously starts with Achilles being wronged by the sons of Atreus. And at that point he says, you know, I'm done with this war. And he retreats, and he just kind of sits by his tent, and the Greeks are in trouble without him. So he doesn't have a grudge against Odysseus, but he does have this tremendous grudge against the sons of Atreus, so Agamemnon and Menelaus, who are leading the endeavor. And then the Greeks have a problem because they need Achilles to win the war. So you're seeing it's a very, very similar sort of plot line to what we see in this play, where a key player whom the Greeks desperately need in order to win the war says, I'm done with the sons of Atreus. I don't want to help them. I don't want to deal with them. Because of my hurt pride. And that's something that, you know, myth keeps coming back to over and over again with different figures. Ajax actually is another example of a very similar storyline.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
Does that mean that Philoctetes is the only person who can use the bow and arrow? Why do they need him too? Is he the only person to use the bow and arrow?
So that is the big, big question of the play. That is, it's a great sort of unresolved question that the play keeps tiptoeing around in very cool ways. There's this implication that Odysseus, I think at some point in Heaney's version, Odysseus says, I'm a great archer myself, which he is. I do not need Philoctetes to win this, to shoot his bow. But there are these implications that the oracle said, Helenus, the captive Trojan oracle said, no, you need both. You need the man and the bow. And so at some point, clearly, Neoptolemus wants to run off with the bow, but then he doesn't. So I'm going to leave it at that. But it's an open question to be explored, not to be answered simply.
Well, yeah, and I feel like it's really interesting to think about this bow as like a symbol that does a lot of different work and actually has these different meanings, right? So the Hercules bow, right, the reason that could kill anyone was because the arrows were dipped in the snake of the Hydra, right? The question is, at what point does it become magical, right? When Hercules gets put, like, when there's the fire and Hercules becomes the god, does it then sort of become magical in a different way? It's again, I think it goes back to this question of open possibilities as opposed to there being a straightforward answer. And although we might want to know, like, here's what's really going on, I think there is something about, even just thinking about other Greek tragedies from this notion of there would have been conflicts in meaning. And that's what they would go and have this discussion, right? After they saw the 3 plays in one day and everyone was voting on who was going to win the next contest, right? Actually having those conversations afterwards about, so what's different in this version? What epic can we get in this version? All those things. Do you have any closing thoughts before we end? Is there anything we didn't get to?
No, I'm just full of gratitude for this opportunity to see this amazing performance. What I was constantly thinking about is just how clever that design is with the creator, because and I'm sure everyone appreciated this. It was multitasking on so many different levels, and it's very different from what we would have seen in the theater of Sophocles, where there would likely have been this kind of elevated sort of little construction to represent the cave, but that this was the crater and also the cave of Philoctetes, and also this amazing kind of existential divide between human beings that could then be bridged by dialogue or by the bow. I was just constantly watching that crater, and also happy that nobody fell into it. that was genius.
Awesome. Well, let's thank Dr. Seamus. It is part of my, I'm fairly new to the Quintessence family. It is part of my mission to have these opportunities for educational development. If you look at your program, there are some opportunities coming up, including taking classes for adults that are more along the lines of play discussion classes. We're going to have Monday night play discussions, reading comedies leading up to The Alchemist. That is going to be part of our next rep that we're super excited about. The other thing is we've just announced Saturday morning acting classes for younger artists. So if you know of anyone who's interested, please get in contact with me because as the world is reopening, Quintessence is very, very excited to continue to have these great discussions. Thank you all for coming.